Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be talking about the Arrow Video Deluxe Special Limited Edition release and new 4K restoration of the 1993 cult classic Demolition Man. Now, this was a surprise announcement from Arrow, as Demolition Man has never been given any sort of special edition treatment from Warner Brothers, who's just sort of dumped it out on each release format. And it's a title that I didn't really think would hit UHD unless a boutique label picked it up due to the film's ever-growing cult status, which especially increased after the COVID pandemic lockdowns made people think back to the film's new future society in San Angeles and certain elements that sort of crept back into the cultural zeitgeist. So I think it kind of gave the film a sort of new lease on life, and thus I think it was a perfect time for Arrow to choose it as a title for 4K UHD, and it being a big 1990s Joel Silver action spectacular shot and finished on film means that it lends itself perfectly to getting a brand new 4K scan from the original negative, and so I was really looking forward to seeing what this UHD would bring. And I was also interested to see what Arrow would bring to the table in terms of the new supplements, as Demolition Man is a film that had a frankly, very troubled production history. It was a very long gestation period, going through innumerable screenplay drafts. Eventually, the original writer was replaced by a variety of other writers, and the original concept was basically only kept in its most basic idea. And eventually Daniel Waters was brought on, and that's when the film really went from being a gritty sort of Lethal Weapon in the far future, with cop and criminal being frozen and thawed out in a completely different landscape. It went from being a very dark, gritty film with an occasional fish out of water or sleeper type joke to being pretty much dominated by that type of humor and the typical sort of Daniel Waters style of irreverence filled with elements of social satire. So it's a film that for me has always been a bit frustrating. It's a film that I like ideas of, I like elements of. I think the cast is all excellent, and of course it's a big Joel Silver production with full action set pieces, and it's still in the 1990s when CGI had not become widespread in its usage, so there's only a handful of CG shots in the film. Everything else is all practical, so that immediately makes my action geek happy. But for me, I think you can feel the sort of behind-the-scenes turmoil. The film did have essentially a new-time feature director in director Marco Brambilla, who had done a lot of commercials and had his experience there and in the art world. And seemingly he was so kind of burned by his experience that he never really did anything on this level again. He directed one other feature and then went back into the art world. There's also a sense of conflicting tone like crazy. It's something that's always kind of bothered me, as while I get what the film is going for by taking the sort of idea of the Sylvester Stallone action hero and putting him in a different landscape and making him the butt of all the jokes, for me, it's at the expense of grit and dramatic weight. And so since we don't have a lot of grittiness. In fact, really, I think only the opening sequence and then the cryo chamber freezing sequence, those are the only moments where you have real dramatic weight to the story. Everything else goes in a completely different direction. So when you see this film for the first time, and some critics and audiences felt this way back in 1993, it is a bit of a rug pull. It feels like you bought tickets for one film and you're actually getting another kind of film. So there is a bit of an adjustment period if you haven't seen this before, as ultimately the film feels like a satirical riff on 90s culture, but also it's basically reworking elements of Brave New World, the famous Aldous Huxley dystopian work that is even referenced in some of the character names. So essentially, if you know classic science fiction dystopia works, you know Brave New World, and you also know both the filmographies of Sylvester Stallone up to that point and the Joel Silver productions, you can very much see what elements the film is pulling from. And I think to this day, it's very much still a film where your results may vary in terms of how much you enjoy the film. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people are kind of mixed on it. I myself, whenever I revisit it, I'm always left a bit cold. No pun intended, of course. It's a film I enjoy more for the production aspects and certain story ideas that I wish had been, worked a little differently or finessed a little more, or I wish there was a bit more world building for the future world, and especially more scenes of dramatic interest to give dramatic weight to the overall character arcs. It's a film whose production I think is actually a bit more fascinating than the actual film itself. And in preparation for this review, I revisited everything in addition to the extras and supplements, but I also read the 2 available script drafts that are floating around online from different eras. One is by the original writer Peter Lenkov, which gives you a good idea of the original gritty concept that is outside of the central idea of cop and criminal being frozen and then thawed out decades later in a different sort of environment, and then continuing their sort of pitched battle. Outside of that concept, it's a completely different film. But then there's also a version of the Daniel Waters script floating around, and of course with all the other writers who were both credited and uncredited on the eventual film. But there's a slightly earlier draft of I guess it's an earlier draft of the shooting script, as it's nearly identical to what we have in the film, but it has all of the extra little pieces that were shot and then deleted, plus 1 or 2 little bits that may have not been shot at all. And the film did have quite a bit of on-set improvisation, particularly for Wesley Snipes' performance. So there's a little bit of difference there. But I think reading those 2 screenplays, actually, and then looking at the other materials, such as the novelization and the comic book adaptation, actually enhance your viewing of the film and your knowledge of the overall production experience, and enhance your knowledge of the overall production history. And I think they do so much to further that I think it's a shame that they weren't or couldn't be included in this Arrow set, as I think I got the most enjoyment and new information out of doing my extra digging around than I did any of the supplements, which are still great, but it sort of covered ground I had already found in other materials and interviews. Now, in terms of the film's plot, for those who haven't seen it, the film deals with Sylvester Stallone's lead character of Super Cop John Spartan, also known as, obviously, Demolition Man, as anything he does or goes into results in some sort of catastrophic explosion. He's going after the super criminal Simon Phoenix, played by Wesley Snipes, who has essentially taken over a whole section of Los Angeles, which is in a full riot state of dystopia in the slightly futuristic setting of 1996. After this rather explosive and more traditional action movie style pre-title sequence, a good number of hostages are unfortunately killed in the crossfire, and so both Phoenix and Spartan are sentenced with the new fate, as given by prisoners in the legal system, of being cryogenically frozen for a specific period of time to serve out their prison sentence and be rehabilitated while in this frozen state. So then we go through that process in the title sequence, and then the basic idea of the plot is that after a number of years and various upheavals, we are now in a completely different future state in the city-state of San Angeles, where Simon Phoenix is brought out for a parole hearing and manages to escape. And since the overall society and police force themselves are completely devoted to peace and have had no knowledge of any sort of physical violence or aggression for a great number of decades, they have to turn to John Spartan. And essentially the idea is set a past cop to catch a past villain. And then we get to all of the fish out of water comedy that's inherent of having a character thrown into a completely different world. And you see John Spartan trying to come to grips with what has happened to him, and this strange, rather bizarre in aspects, emotionally cut off landscape that he's in while trying to catch the man who destroyed his entire life and come to grips with the fact that he's been cryogenically frozen for so long and thus lost everything. So there's a lot of room for, of course, comedy with the fish out of water material for both Spartan and Phoenix. There's room for Stallone to be able to play comedy and to work around his screen persona, and this was really the film that proved his adeptness at being able to not only poke fun at himself, but to play around in the comedy vein, and it's rooted in his sort of action star machismo in that sense. So it actually works, and I think this is the film film that showed everybody that Stallone can actually successfully do comedy. It gives you plenty of room for inherent satire of the 1990s and sort of pushing that into the future, and that, I think, is the film's most memorable aspect, and this is what has led it to becoming such a cult classic. I think the overall supporting cast being so well chosen helps to cement this idea. I think the real key is Sandra Bullock's performance as Lenina Huxley, and she's really the sort of glue that holds these disparate elements together, because she has the right tone in her performance to balance the inherent humor. It's playing it with a straight face, because these people of the future obviously have no idea how ridiculous they look to the audience, and that if they knew they were funny, it's the old classic idea of comedy writing. If the characters know that they're funny or being ridiculous, then the material is no longer funny, it no longer works. But as great as the overall cast is, I think the highlight of the film is Wesley Snipes' performance as Simon Phoenix. He's basically having an absolute field day, devouring every frame of the film he's in. When he's on screen, the film has energy, drive, and a sense of danger, because his character is a complete wild card. You never know what his actions are going to be next. He also seems completely psychotic and delights in it. And Snipes' performance goes to such extremes, such delightful extremes, and has such a manic energy in ways that for me, I think this is one of the great performances of the Joker, even though it's obviously not the same character. The Simon Phoenix characterization in the film, in the Snipes performance, has so much of the elements of the Clown Prince of Crime that I think it's impossible for Batman fans to see this and not think that a lot of the character's humor and one-liners and psychopathic tendencies, I mean, it just screams Joker throughout. So, I mean, it's one of the great sort of live-action performances of the Clown Prince of Crime, even though it isn't a Joker performance. I think it is the highlight of the entire film experience, and every time I revisit this, the film is at its best. It has its most energy whenever Snipes is on screen, whenever we have the Simon Phoenix character, because that character sort of shakes up the status quo in both the opening setup and then throughout all of the rest of the film in the future world. He sort of rattles the cages, and this gives all of the scenes an individual energy that drives the film along, and I think really goes a long way to addressing the issue I've always had with the film, in that because the focus was so shifted to having a comedic flavor at the expense of a sense of dramatic weight, or having anything to really ground things and to, as some would put it, pull the balloon back down to really ground the story once again, to keep the audience invested. I think the Simon Phoenix character being so unpredictable and wild, and bringing that energy every time Snipes is on screen, I think that goes a long way to sort of at least keeping some of that feeling of danger in. The film, of course, does have a subplot where in the future world, the leader Cocteau, played by Nigel Hawthorne, has complete control over all the inhabitants and has a desire to increase that control even further, and all while being thwarted by those who would not follow his city ordinances and directives, and thus have chose to live deep in the underground underbelly of the wasteland, essentially. They are known as the Scraps. So there's a little bit of a sort of political conspiracy going on behind the scenes, and this will, of course, interconnect with the main plot. But since the focus is so much more on comedy, this subplot is never really fleshed out, and it's actually revealed quite early. And if you're an astute viewer, even on the first viewing, you can already start to put together the plot elements rather quickly and figure out where things are going. And unfortunately, because the overall world building and the actual dramatic elements aren't as developed as I would like, these have always added a bit to my frustration levels. This is a film that you go into, at least from my perspective, in terms of just going in for the entertainment value and the inherent satirical elements and humor. I just wish it had more world building. I wish there was more about the actual actual transition from the 1996 we see in the opening to the future state, because all we really get in the film, aside from some costumes and some futuristic cars and a few elements we're allowed to see, all we really get is some exposition, and it's not even a whole lot of exposition. It's just sort of sprinkled in like breadcrumbs. The other issue is that without feelings of dramatic weight, without scenes that go darker, without the comedy that can border on goofiness, without scenes that are scenes of actual drama, there's nothing that weights the story down. And in particular, there were scenes that were shot that were then deleted from the film, where Spartan encounters his now adult daughter, who is of course older than he is. And we also lost the scene before the freezing in the opening, where he has to say goodbye to his family. So this was a through line that at least gave some dramatic weight to the film's plot and John Spartan's character arc, and all of those have been removed. It wasn't very much, but at least it was something to at least continue that idea that there is some dramatic weight for this character to have to learn how to deal with. There's baggage that he carries. We also lost a supporting character death, which was shot and apparently cut out. So there are a number of small pieces of the film that were shot and removed, or removed in the various script drafts. As you read through the development history of the film, as you go through the production history and the supplements, you can start to see how this developed over time, and you get this sense that the overall story concept was kept, but everything else kept being watered down further and further and further. The writers had to eventually start tailoring the film towards specific star leads, and they didn't just immediately go to Stallone. They went to others first. So the film was tailored for Jean-Claude Van Damme. Then it was retailored for Steven Seagal. It was thought Schwarzenegger might do it at a time. They went through all the big names, and then eventually when Stallone came on board, he had ideas, and they had to tailor it for him, and then it went through further revisions and further writers. And then Daniel Waters was brought on, and he rewrote the whole film with a comedy theme in mind in a very short space of time. I think he said it was about 2 weeks or so. And then that got further revisions, and other writers came on, and then there were on-set revisions. So if you read that original Peter Lenkov script especially, it is such a completely different approach. It's a different film. I mean, it's not even like a different film. It is literally a different film, and it is full-on gritty, and for me, it was a better reading experience than what I've always felt about the film, although that version online is an earlier draft. It needs a little bit more development in areas, but it has all the dramatic weight that I always wanted in Demolition Man. And suddenly it was that light bulb going off in my head moment of, oh, this is all the dramatic weight I was always wanting and felt like should be there at least in some form in the film. Okay. And so if you start at that point and then you go to the version of the Daniel Waters script that's online, which is pretty similar to what the actual film is, then you get an interesting effect, because reading the Daniel Waters script draft that's floating around, even though it's, I'd say, about 90% of what we see in the film outside of the on-set ad-libs and things, the way that reads, it has consistency where the film doesn't. And in fact, I enjoyed reading the Waters script draft more than rewatching the film, because actually reading his script, it had consistency. It also had the deleted bits, especially the stuff with Spartan's family and his daughter. It had the extra supporting character death. It had the extra action beats between John Spartan and Simon Phoenix, and the aftermath of the battle in the Scraps underworld, and also had a little bit more in the final conclusion, which seems like it was hastily reworked while they were shooting. So the script does have a bit more in terms of dramatic meat in that sense, but also the tone was fully consistent, which I've always felt the film doesn't do a very good job at balancing that. So again, this is another sign of how, for whatever reason, I find the actual production history and story development of Demolition Man, along with certain plot elements and certain production aesthetics, I find researching the film actually more engaging than actually watching the film. And I think this is a good example of how this film is very divisive. It is a film that was actually very readily accepted in the UK and Europe, where the idea of social satire and, of course, camp humor, it's much easier to sell a higher concept comedy to British and European audiences than it is to an American audience. That's just a sort of typical rule of thumb. You usually see films of this type do much better overseas. But also here in the US, it's always been very much sold as a straight ahead sci fi action film with Stallone, or a Stallone vehicle. So people coming to it, even now, as they did in 1993, are probably going to be a bit perplexed if they've never heard of the film before and they don't realize what they're actually watching. Once you get past the necessary opening, it becomes a completely different film. The film did also have quite a bit of trouble in the editing process, and also had to be cut down to be rated. It did get an R rating. So I think overall you get the sense that there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen over the whole development process, then throughout the whole production process. And it being a Joel Silver production means that it has his stamp on everything. And then, of course, you have Stallone's input and the studio's input and then the marketing department's input. So all of this stuff comes together. And so I think it's a miracle we got a solid, successful film with all of those tweaks and changes and compromises. And this was over a very long process, as the original Peter Lenkov scripts were written in the late 1980s, and we didn't actually get the film until 1993. So this was a long process, and by the time we get to the finished film and the finished release version, it's dramatically different. If you were curious to get a sort of feeling of what Demolition Man would be like with some extra bits of dramatic material, some extra characterization, some of the extra plot threads a bit more fleshed out, and also having the bits of deleted materials, I would suggest looking at the versions of the script that are floating around online that I'll have linked in the description. But especially take a look at the comic adaptation, which was done for the film's release and spread out into 4 issues. This does have some of the deleted material and has some grittier moments, so I think that's an interesting sort of alternate version of the film. But even better is the sadly very rare paperback tie-in novelization. I was able to find this in a library and read through it. So writer Richard Osborne does, I think, a better job of world building than what we see in the film. And of course, it's a novelization, so you have a different form, you have more time to play around with these elements, but it's also still a mass market paperback, so it's not significantly long. But actually, in terms of the story we see in the film, that version, I think the novelization is a richer story experience. I think you get more from the characterizations due to having internal monologue. I think you also benefit from having all the scenes that were cut from the film. I think you also get some elements of world building that I guess the author must have written himself or developed, or he might have been working from one of the earlier script drafts we just haven't got to see, because there are apparently dozens and dozens of script drafts from all the different writers, and it'd be fascinating to be able to read all of them someday. But in terms of other editions of the film story or the experience of Demolition Man, I think the novelization is actually the richest and most complete, comprehensive version. So if you haven't read it and you love the film, or even if you're more like me and you're more of a passing fan but you really enjoy certain aspects of the story, try to find a copy of this paperback novelization, because I think it goes a long way to addressing some of the story issues. And regardless of how much you like the film, I think it will enhance the overall viewing experience, because then you go back to the film and you know all this extra material from the novelization that nicely feeds into the film. And actually, the novelization, rather strikingly, in the fight scenes and the bits of violence and the action, it's actually more graphic than the film. So I can very easily see the film struggling to not get an NC-17 rating at first in terms of the initial edits, and having to be cut down to make sure that they got that R rating, because reading the novelization, For example, when Simon Phoenix fights the completely inept police forces when he first gets to San Angeles, he brutally murders all of them. I mean, it's very graphically written in the novelization, whereas you don't get any of that in the film because the tone is completely different. And that brings up another aspect I've wondered about, and I think does actually come into play with Demolition Man, and that's the actual runtime. The film is about 115 minutes, so just under 2 hours. And when you look at the bits of material that were deleted, none of them are particularly long, and crucial is all the material with John Spartan's daughter. So I think losing some of that material may have also been just to get the runtime under 2 hours in order to get more showtimes in a day and to get it essentially packaged like a traditional action blockbuster of the time period. So I think that may also be a factor, not just cutting the action scenes to make sure they got an R rating, but also I think there might have been at least some factor of getting the film under 2 hours. Of course, the film did have a pretty massive marketing campaign with all kinds of tie-ins. I think best of all of those is the 1994 Williams Pinball machine, which is part of their wide-body series. This is a really fun and very well-liked pinball machine from the era, which is really the sort of golden era of great pinball machines. The notable gimmick of this machine is, of course, it's a wide body, but it has the metal handles with triggers on the actual sides of the machine itself. And the idea is that you can use those instead of the flipper buttons and also use it for special modes. So it does have a bit of a novelty factor to it, but it is very well designed and still fun to play today. And I think it also had custom voice recordings from the original principal cast as well. Ultimately, Demolition Man was relatively successful on its original release. It certainly didn't have the same box office fate as Last Action Hero did, which also plays around in the using a big name action star in a big film that's actually more of a satire of the action film and 90s culture. So if you needed a double feature pairing, Last Action Hero and Demolition Man go together perfectly. But Demolition Man I think reached its audience over its video release history. I think more people saw it on video, and I think this is one of the films that the more times you see it, the more you get on its wavelength. Some people love it from the first time, but I know myself, it took at least 2 or 3 viewings before I got more on board with its particular style and the very definite tonal shifts that it has throughout. It's also a film that became a cult classic over this period of time, and so now it has a very dedicated cult following, and this ties into the film's overall acceptance today, and thus we can now get a lovely Arrow 4K Limited Deluxe Special Edition. So to talk about the new master, Arrow Video was able to go back to the original camera negative and do a brand new 4K scan and restoration on their own. This is really great, as the film has never had a really spiffy video transfer. It's just been done by Warner as a generic release, first on Laserdisc and VHS, then as one of the initial snapper case first wave DVD titles, and then eventually they did a basic HD master and released that on a standard Blu-ray many years ago. So this, I think, is a film that had a similar fate to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and then Arrow Video comes along, does a brand new 4K scan, and it basically looks like a completely new film because we no longer are looking at super outdated old Warner Video Masters. Now, the really notable aspect is that Arrow includes 2 versions of the film, as the film did have the alternative Pizza Hut version, which is one of the most notorious alternate versions of films. In the actual film, in terms of the US and original release version, they had to get a fast food company to do a promotional tie-in and couldn't get anybody to agree. The idea was that after the so-called franchise wars, that only one restaurant was victorious, and thus all restaurants of the future were this particular fast food chain. And so in the film, as we saw it and have always seen it in the US, that is Taco Bell. This was hastily tweaked for the British and international release versions, as it was felt Taco Bell was not a well-known commodity in the UK especially. So in that version, it was changed to Pizza Hut. But this was done by merely doing a hysterically bad redub of a scene of dialogue between Sandra Bullock and Sylvester Stallone, and then the establishing shot of them pulling into the fancy restaurant. The sign on the outside was essentially tweaked in post to replace the Taco Bell logo with a Pizza Hut one, but then nothing else was changed, and you can clearly see the Taco Bell logos, and they're still served a plate of what looks like, tiny future health nachos or something. But this became sort of legend on the internet until people figured out that you had the American version and then the international version, and then depending on what country you lived in or what video master was being used, it was going to be one or the other. And this is the first release to actually include both, so that meant Arrow had to actually go and find the international specific materials, retransfer them, and include them in the restoration to make a branched version. So when you put the disc in, you're first asked which version you prefer, and that's really the one difference between the two. I think also the end credits are slightly different to accommodate the different franchises, but I think that's pretty much it. So now we turn to the actual picture transfer itself, which is, of course, from this brand new 4K restoration, and it's also been given Dolby Vision HDR by Arrow on this release. Now, since Arrow carried out all the work themselves, I think the actual technical quality is far beyond what the Warner Studio label would have done, obviously. But this also, as I mentioned, it looks like a brand new film experience, really. And it's hard to tell the actual accuracy of this because all the past versions have been based on old video masters, probably scanning an inner positive, and they all have a specific look. It's also a bit dark and dingy looking in ways, especially if you go back to the original masterings in standard definition. So to see the film now on this release, there's such a wealth of fine detail and preserved film grain and just an overall visual overhaul that it does take the viewer a minute to get used to it if you've seen the film a number of times before on the past video releases. Especially the color timing is a bit different. There is more detail in the skin tones, but also a sort of almost pinkish hue to them in areas. I don't know if that's because this new scan and HDR is revealing more of what was originally there. I think it probably is. But also you'll note that all of the sort of light, cold blues of a lot of the facilities, and especially the futuristic police station, those are now a different sort of shade, sort of going more into the territory of teal color, but nowhere near the sort of overzealous bad teal color timing as seen on certain Warner 4K masters, such as the Tim Burton Batman films, Batman Returns suffering it the worst of all. But I have to admit, it did throw me a bit seeing this new transfer, because I was so used to all the old video masters looking a particular way. But again, it's hard to really make a direct comparison because those are all coming from particular older sources. This is a brand new negative scan, and the visual overhaul is such that it looks like a completely different film in terms of the overall increase in every aspect of picture quality. So I think the overall transfer is a lightning leap forward. Thankfully, the grain is nicely preserved. I only noticed a tiny amount of the occasional light speck or bit of debris or two. So I'd rather see something like that than see what most studio labels would do of automated grain removal and heavier grain management, resulting in a processed image or the dreaded frozen grain halos. So thankfully there's none of that here. So I don't mind if there's a tiny, almost infinitesimal speck or two scattered throughout the entirety of the feature. Now, in terms of the HDR, I think the overall Dolby Vision presentation is well done. The only thing I noticed is that some of the highlights are now a bit bright. Since the outdoor scenes were shot with a aesthetic to really bring the reflections of sunlight out to sort of suggest a further degenerated ozone and more polluted atmosphere, there are, of course, all these bright reflections everywhere, and with HDR, those do get picked up a bit. Also, all of the reflections, particularly since the police badges of the uniforms in the future are quite large and they're metallic, they catch the light a lot. So basically, all the reflections and highlights of the film, I think, were a bit bright with this HDR presentation. I think that's probably a trade-off of having HDR applied to this particular catalog title. Personally, I thought it was a bit much. Others may not agree, but I am very sensitive to HDR and catalog titles. But otherwise, I do think the Dolby Vision version is a lovely enhancement. But this being Arrow, this also means that they properly presented the film in HDR10 and SDR. And of course, there is a separately available deluxe SDR Blu-ray. So whatever your setup can accommodate, you will have the best possible experience in SDR, HDR10, or Dolby Vision. Arrow is one of the companies or labels that really excels at this. Most, unfortunately, don't really seem to bother or care about the presentation in other forms of HDR, if they even have Dolby Vision. So that's always nice to see that Arrow tries to make sure that all three are nicely done. Now, I did notice one particular visual quirk that I was unsure about. It's at the very start of the opening shot of the burning Hollywood sign. And I don't know if this is somehow inherent to the materials and it's just now revealed more since this is a higher resolution 4K scan. But as the camera pans over the burning Hollywood sign, and of course it's an effect shot, so the quality is lesser, at the tail end of the shot in the upper right corner, there's what looks like a sort of it's not quite a block, but it is the whole upper right portion of the frame. But it starts to come in and it looks like just a bit of noise. I'm not sure what caused that. It's not on any of the past versions that I've been able to ascertain. I just don't know if that was something inherent to the elements now being more revealed since it was an effect shot, or if it's indeed an error in the master. But it's almost translucent. It's very hard to spot. I just happened to notice it because it's a lot harder to miss things in 4K resolution watching on an OLED at home, especially in Dolby Vision. So any sort of artifact is a lot more noticeable. But that some of the HDR brightness quibbles and color timing quibbles, and then the one or two tiny specks throughout the whole feature, those are really the only things I noticed in the visual presentation. Otherwise, this is such a lightning leap over everything we've had before. They don't even really compare. I think the big difference here is this is a brand new 4K negative scan with the two different versions giving the viewer the choice, as opposed to much older standard Warner scans of what seems to have just been an interpositive. Now, in terms of the audio, we have three choices. There's a brand new Atmos remix, there is the original 5.1 mix, and the original 2.0 Matrix Dolby Stereo track. Now, this film was released in 1993 at the start of the digital sound era, so it was actually mixed in 5.1 seemingly on the original release. But the film only carries a Dolby Stereo credit on the end credits and all the promotional materials, and that was still the sort of de facto standard for the vast majority of theaters. So all films from the early to mid 90s really are more geared for the older era of mixing, and so it was only select 5.1 mixes that really used the new discrete 6-channel format to its fullest extent. And for these reasons, I think it's really important to preserve both the original 5.1 and 2.0 Matrix stereo tracks of all of these films, as some do have notable differences, and some are more geared towards others, and some actually have Matrix stereo tracks that are better mixed and integrated than the 5.1 discrete versions. Now, with Demolition Man, when you compare all the audio tracks, you can see how they each have their pluses and minuses. But the actual mix of the film has never been one that I felt was all that super engaging or as bombastic as it could have been even for that time period. I think it is a mix that is still very much geared around Matrix stereo, like the first three Lethal Weapon films, also, of course, produced by Joel Silver. So when I watched the film and compared the Matrix stereo and 5.1 again, I came away, as I usually do, feeling that the Matrix stereo track is actually the best mix overall. It's the one that's, of course, suited to the era. It was one of the original release formats, but the mix itself being a bit more limited and a bit more 1980s in terms of its mixing style, I think the Matrix Stereo version is actually better integrated than the 5.1 version. But of course, most people probably aren't going to feel that way, and so Aero has nicely made sure that with 3 audio options, they've essentially pleased everybody and made sure to include both original audio presentations. So we have the Matrix Stereo for us audio purists, we have the 5.1 iteration for those who prefer discrete audio, and there's the new Atmos remix. Now, in terms of the quality of all of these, the 5.1 is basically what we've seen on the past Warner Blu-ray and DVD, which had 5.1 tracks. They had no version of the Matrix Stereo. So getting the Matrix Stereo back in some form is the first time we've had it since VHS and Laserdisc, which is great. However, there is unfortunately an issue with the Matrix Stereo track. For some reason, it cuts off the opening music cue, which starts under the Warner Brothers opening titles. Instead, on the 2.0 track on the Arrow release, the music actually starts in the opening shots of the burning Hollywood sign, and that was not an issue on the VHS and Laserdisc. Also, I think there has been just a tiny bit of noise reduction or processing. So when I compare the Laserdisc audio to the Arrow 2.0 track, I do come away preferring the Laserdisc audio. And of course, it doesn't have the opening music slightly trimmed. So unfortunately, there are these slight issues with the Arrow Matrix Stereo track, but at least it does still sound very good. And we have a version of it here. But I do think the Laserdisc is overall better, and since I do think this is the best mix of the film, and it is one of the original mixes, I do think it's kind of a shame that of the 3, it had to be the Matrix Stereo track that had these slight issues. So from an audio purist standpoint, if you want the absolute best audio of the film, you need the Laserdisc, and it's hard to get a copy of the LD because this particular release, for whatever reason, does have a number of rot issues. So I did have to go through 1 or 2 copies to find one that didn't have any major Laserdisc rot. The 5.1 sounded similar to how I had heard it on past Warner releases, but again, I just don't think it's as good as the Matrix Stereo is, actually. The Atmos is a rather tasteful upmixing of the original mix. It basically allows the sound field to be spread out further with the overhead channels, and there is more bass enhancement, so the LFE track is used a bit more, so it's going to rumble a bit more than the original 5.1 iteration. So it's basically a tasteful, modernized version of the original 5.1 mix, I would say. I don't really think it's necessary, but if you love this film and you have a high-end modern home theater and you really want the sound field to be more engaging and to really utilize your full Atmos setup, then you have the option of looking at this tastefully done Atmos remix by Arrow. And it does have a 7.1 core track, so you can listen to it in a modern home theater if you don't have Atmos and get the same overall effect. It just won't be as prominent without the overhead Atmos channels. Now let's talk about the packaging and overall artwork. This is in Arrow's new style of limited edition hard case with an actual slipcover that's tightly fitted. So we have a version of the original artwork. It is slightly different as we now have the blue text on the bottom, and the overall layout's a little bit different compared to the original poster artwork as seen on past video releases, which has the orange text on the sides. I'll also say that if you actually look closely at the key artwork, it is a little bit softer. That's just something I noticed because I have these other versions and I was looking at all of them again, but it still is nicely done. And I think you always need to retain some form of the original artwork. That's just a particular printing difference I noticed. So then we have the title logo font on the spine, and then the rear with all the supplements listed in the Arrow style. The hard case has the alternate artwork Arrow has come up with, which is also on the reversible sleeve. So we have the film logo and then the logo and shield of the San Angeles Police Department on the back. We have the same version of the film's key art on the actual case with the Arrow logo. The rear is the same. Here is the reversible artwork with the logo, so if you were curious to see what that looked like on the actual case. And then the rear is slightly tweaked to have the same color scheme. Inside the case, we find the single UHD disc with the poster artwork and then the printed art cards. Now, unfortunately, like pretty much all Aero UHDs, outside of a few exceptions, this only contains the UHD disc. So if you want the Blu-ray, you have to actually purchase that separately. They are not sold as a dual format release. While I understand it's, of course, less expensive to have both discs in a release, I really wish for these limited sets that Aero would include a Blu-ray just so you had full format capability, and you could also just look at the Blu-ray disc if you needed to, and that way you wouldn't have to purchase a separate SDR disc if you needed it. Aero will sometimes include both format discs randomly, usually on the Steelbook releases when they do those, so I just don't know why they do it sporadically. Nicely, the Aero advertising insert has the film's poster art on the other side, and here you can see it is the full original poster with the orange text. Here are the art cards, which are nicely done, basically using original production stills, and as Aero will do, they nicely have the poster artwork on the back. So these are all original production stills, which you can also find in the on-disc image gallery, but it's always a nice touch to get nicely printed versions inside the deluxe package. Then, rather amusingly, there are additional printed supplements that aren't typically what you find in these packages. So what Aero did was actually include stickers of some of the famous bits from the film. So there is a sticker of the Life is Hell graffiti that we see the scraps spray on and deface buildings with. But most amusingly, we have stickers of the iconic Notorious 3 seashells, whose usage in terms of future bathrooms is never quite explained, and quickly becomes the bane of the existence of our unfrozen characters. So this is obviously not something that was necessary, but it's a really nice, cute little touch. So that means you could obviously put the 3 seashells in your bathroom, just to complete the overall idea. Then, as we usually see in these limited Aero packages, we have a nice fold-out reproduction of the original poster with good quality, so it's nicely frameable. On the flip side, we have the new poster mock-up that Aero has created with the Demolition Man logo on this background. Then we have a nice substantial printed book, nicely outfitted with the morality violation meter spitting out paper as you open it, so that's a really nice touch, and it has a slight wraparound effect with this sort of metallic look to make it look like one of the notorious annoying machines on your wall. Inside we have 4 lovely new essays and critical pieces with the usual nice selection of production stills and nicely readable text, so this is what we've come to expect from Aero booklets. The essay pieces are pretty good and are a nice addition to the supplements package. My only issue with this book, and something I've talked about on certain other Aero releases, is actually the paper stock or the actual materials they've used, because while this isn't as bad as the Barbarella release, it is one of those that has a slight odor to it. So if you are at all odor sensitive or nose sensitive to things like this, this is another of these Aero booklets that just has a particular smell to it. It's again not bad, not super pungent, and nowhere near as smelly as the Barbarella book was in that limited edition, but it's just something I notice on Aero books more and more in these limited sets, and it also means that the whole box has this slight odor, so if you're at all sensitive to that, it is something you will notice when they use this particular type of material. Again, it's not on every release, but for whatever reason, this occurs more and more on certain Aero limited packages. And then lastly, we have the all-important technical and restoration notes. So this gives you all the information about the new transfer, 4K scan, grading, HDR, the sourcing of the audio mixes, and then the quality control and disc encoding and everything. So this is always the meat and potatoes of the actual booklet information, and thankfully Aero does give us all of the necessary information, which is sadly something that not every label does. So all of these slot back into the hard case rather nicely, although I would say it does help to line everything up first because you want to make sure not to damage anything. But speaking of that, these slip covers that Arrow uses, they are a little bit finicky getting on and off because they are sized to fit these slimmer hard cases. You want to be extremely careful taking them on and off. So you want to take your time to line them up just right, because it is very easy to bend or tear these, as these are still, relatively thin slip covers. And as you can see, they are fitted very tightly around. So it's a nice effect to have a slip cover over a hard case, but I myself am more of a fan of just printing the poster art on the hard case, or, just the way that we're sort of used to these hard case sets now. Of course, the slipcover does keep the materials from sliding out of the open side, but I don't know. I've used these, and now I'm getting more used to the idea of having these fitted slip covers over the hard cases in a set, but you just want to be really careful when you take them on and off, because they are fitted so perfectly that you might risk damaging them if you're not being careful about it. Now we turn to the supplemental features packages, which of course starts by giving the viewer the option of selecting either the US release version or the Taco Bell version, or selecting the international or UK version, also known as the Pizza Hut version. These are seamlessly branched, so you get to select them at the menu, and they're then able to view the film in either way. The main bulk of the supplements are actually the 3 audio commentaries. The first is the original director-producer commentary with Marco Brambilla and Joel Silver. That was done for the original DVD release, so that is ported over. And it's a track that at first you might think is just going to be your usual sort of press release style of a track, of not getting into the nitty gritty or any of the production hassles and details. But it over time becomes actually quite insightful, as the director really opens up about his intent and how difficult it was to get certain shots, but it doesn't really talk much about the extreme story development process and all the drafts and the onset tension and different things. It's sort of addressed a little bit just in discussion. But really oddly, Joel Silver is there at the start of the track, and you think he's going to be talking throughout, and then he just disappears. So it's almost like he was sitting there and said hello and started the track, and then I guess couldn't be bothered or got bored and just left the room and went off. So it's basically a solo director's commentary after the first couple minutes. And even though it's rather, straightforward, it's actually, I think, a very insightful commentary and definitely helps one's appreciation of the film. The second is a brand new track done for this release with Marco Brambilla coming back, but also with Daniel Waters. So it does cover a lot of the same ground as the director commentary, but it's basically enlivened by Daniel Waters' irreverent humor, and also talking about what he brought to the screenplay and how the process was a bit weird because he was brought on late and only wrote on it for 2 weeks, and wrote a lot of it while standing in line trying to get Tonight Show tickets. So it's more humorous than the director commentary, but winds up covering a lot of the same ground just from a 2024 in hindsight perspective. So it will add a bit more to your appreciation of the film, but if you've already read about the film or looked at extras before or heard the first commentary, it won't exactly bring a lot of new material that you hadn't already experienced, but it's still a good listen, and it's enlivened because they're both talking in a conversation. The third commentary track is another new one done for this release, and this is actually what I was most looking forward to. This is critic and podcaster Mike White of the Projection Booth podcast, who did a extensive, quite long Demolition Man episode a number of years ago, and got a lot of really great crew interviews that he's able to quote from and reference throughout this commentary. And he's also a giant fan, as he saw the film day of release and loved it so much that he went back and saw it twice on the same day. So he has a nice perspective, but if you've heard the Projection Booth episode, you'll have already heard the interviews that he's pulling from and quoting from. So I'd say the first half of this commentary references those a lot. So if you're like me and you recently re-listened to that episode to prepare for rewatching the film and diving into the extras, it will be a bit repetitive, but it is really good material, and it's firsthand material that otherwise we wouldn't really have access to. So if you've heard that podcast episode, it's going to be the second half of his commentary that's the more insightful, because that's where he starts talking about the film more and isn't quoting so much from the interviews he conducted in the past. So it's probably, I think, the most comprehensive of the three commentaries. And if you listen to only one, this is going to be the best one to listen to because you're getting more of a picture of the whole production and the history of it, and getting to hear from multiple different original crew members. And of all the supplements on the disc, it is the most comprehensive about the whole world of the film. So if you were only to look at one of the supplements in the entire special features package, it should be the Mike White commentary. And if you want to hear more about the film and hear the original crew interviews in full, you can go to the Projection Booth website and listen to the original episode, which I will leave linked in the description below as well. The major new video extra is a 17-minute new video essay entitled Somewhere Over the Rambo. This is by critic Josh Nelson, and it should very quickly indicate that this is drawing parallels to The Wizard of Oz, while also referencing Stallone's career, the style of Joel Silver-produced films, and what the overall themes and style of Demolition Man means in all those aspects, and how it's playing around with the preconceived cinematic star image of Sylvester Stallone, all the while making consistent and rather appropriate linkages to The Wizard of Oz. So it's a quite insightful video essay, and it's well done, well put together, edited with clips of the film in 1080p. So it's just a 1080p selection of film clips and stills around the 17-minute video essay. Demolition Design is a new 14-minute interview with the film's production designer, who of course also had worked on Super Mario Brothers, which explains some of the visual aesthetics that are similar between the two films, but he'd also worked on Blade Runner in a different capacity. So he had a wealth of experience just in science fiction films of that time period. And he talks about the challenges and difficulties of working on this film in particular, and gives good insight. Although he has done other interviews, especially for the Projection Booth podcast. So if you've heard his interview there, it's basically a longer form version of this shorter 14-minute interview here, covering some of the same ground, but all of it is very important and also helps to tell the story of the film's production even further. The next interview is entitled Cryo Action, which is an interview with the film's stunt coordinator and second unit director. He talks about the film's production as well from the stunt and action perspective, also addressing a bit of how the crew overall felt that the director was not quite experienced in the field of big budget action filmmaking, so that created a particular environment on the set. But it's a nice interview. It's conducted over Zoom, so it's very straightforward, but it's nicely edited and the quality is good, mixed in with bits and images from the film, but it only runs about 6 minutes. The next piece is entitled Big's Body Shop. This is another interview done over Zoom, mixed in with clips and images of the film, talking about the overall practical makeup effects, which are actually a bit more intricate than one might think originally, but also it focuses on the anecdote of how for the film's visual sex sequence that they had to make some nude prosthetics for Sandra Bullock that were something that was not exactly something that you would think of ever having to do, but it's just one of those odd predicaments that effects people find themselves in, suddenly having to come up with a particular prop or item to do things in the film, whether it's actually fully used or not, which it's really only in a brief flash during that sequence in the film, but it's an amusing anecdote that's told in this interview. Then the last interview is entitled Tacos and Hockey Pucks. This is with the film's body effects coordinator, and it's focused entirely on the creation of all of the body props inside of what were termed the frozen hockey pucks in the giant cryo prison chamber of all the frozen prisoners and all the frozen body forms. It runs about 10 minutes, and it's at length about all the challenges the production faced, of how difficult it was to actually create these effects physically, to make all these props, to figure out what sort of fluid to put in the pucks that was also not going to be harmful to the actual actors who had to go in there, and also the hurdles faced by the production on the actual set as when they started shooting one of these these pucks actually caught fire due to the fact that the materials that they had to use inside were actually set ablaze by the intense hot studio lighting. So it was not an easy process to arrive at. So it does go into nice detail about the creation and usage of these particular props for the cryo prison chamber. Then we close out with the film's original trailer, which sadly is an old standard definition upscale. It looks just like what we saw on all the old Warner home video masters. So if you only own the new Arrow release and you were curious about how the old Warner masters may have looked, all you have to do is look at the trailer, even though it's upscaled standard definition and doesn't look that great. That will give you an idea of the sort of color and aesthetic of how the old Warner home video masters have looked all these years. Then we close out with a nice image gallery that has really lovely, high quality original production photos, set stills, promotional photos. Some are a little bit lower in resolution, but that's to be expected as they're going to be coming from a variety of sources. There's also versions of the original poster art, and most notably, there's actually a set photo of Stallone with Jackie Chan, who visited the set, and originally it was an idea that some in the production wanted to try and get Jackie Chan to actually play the villain, to play the Simon Phoenix role. At the time, Jackie Chan didn't really ever want to play villains, and so that idea didn't really go anywhere, but since Chan is actually name-dropped in the final film, it's really cool to see that he actually did visit the production, so you can almost wonder what the film would have been like had he actually played a role. And that closes out the extras portion of this release. So this is by far a significant upgrade over the pretty bare-bones Warner releases, which only added the first director's commentary for the DVD, and that's all they did besides sticking the not good quality trailer on. But this still didn't quite scratch my itch in terms of wanting to know more about the film's production. I had gone into this hoping that there would be at least some extra that got into the nitty-gritty details, but of course, people don't really usually want to go into that stuff, and it's not like it's easy to get a whole bunch of script drafts approved to be released in some form. You have to go through all kinds of legal hurdles and rights issues and things, but at some point, I do hope that at least some of the other script drafts from all the various writers and development process is somehow released to the public. I just wish that there had been an extra on this release that was a little bit more detailed in terms of the production and story development than what we've seen in other interviews and the projection booth episode. And so while this is a really nice overall extras package, it just didn't really get into all the details that I was looking for. Since I've already read a lot about this film and listened to interviews from original crew members and things, it didn't really tell me anything that I didn't already know or know something about. So honestly, I got more out of reading the two script drafts that are floating around online and then looking at the comic and the novelization than I did the actual on-disc supplements. But again, that stuff isn't necessarily able to be included. But since this is a limited edition set with a book already included, I think it would have been really cool had Arrow been able to somehow maybe get the rights to the novelization, since that's out of print and it's just a small paperback anyway. That would have been a really cool pack-in, as there are a lot of significant differences, and that's a harder 90s paperback to get. It's usually it's not super expensive, but it's usually $30 to $50 on eBay or more. So if I could have done anything differently for the extras package, that probably would have been something I would have tried to have done, or also, if possible, including some of the script drafts, even if they were just a PDF on the disc or something. So ultimately, the new Arrow Video 4K restoration and limited edition release of Demolition Man on Blu-ray and UHD is a giant leap forward over the old, outdated, pretty bare bones Warner masters on past releases. This is the sort of deluxe edition treatment that I didn't think the film would ever get unless a label was inspired to make such a release, given the film's great cult status. So that has finally happened, and we've seen a lovely Arrow overhaul and brand new work that they carried out themselves, which is far beyond what the Warner Studio label would have done. Unfortunately, there are some quirks that I've identified in this review, and while as a film it's always been a bit mixed for me, I do really enjoy coming back to it and looking into its production history again, and this time with the Arrow supplements and then doing my own further research, I was able to find new facets that I hadn't looked at before, specifically going into the screenplay drafts and then the other versions of the film in the comic and novelization. While not the perfect slam dunk of a release that I hoped it would be, the Arrow release is still extraordinarily impressive and far beyond what the Warner Studio label would have done with the same materials. And I do think it is very well done and certainly worth the purchase price for fans of the film. And if you're interested in the limited edition, it is at a nice affordable price point in both the US and the UK, and once it sells out, it will be replaced by the standard edition without all the printed swag. So if you're not as big a fan of the film, you could just wait for that release. But in any case, this is a giant technical leap forward, if a new release that is unfortunately not fully perfect. So if you're an audio purist, I do think the Laserdisc audio is still really important, but you do need to try and find a copy that doesn't have any laser rot. I would also encourage fans of the film or anyone interested to look at the other materials I mentioned. So in the description, I will have links to the Projection Booth podcast episode, the 2 screenplay drafts, information about the comic and novelization, and even the wonderful pinball machine. So as always, I hope my babbles about classic catalog films and their physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. This was a nice surprise announcement from Arrow for both myself and great fans of the film, of course, and is such a improvement over the old Warner releases that it's hard to really compare them. I just wish it didn't have the certain quirks and issues that I've found and identified, but still, it is an extremely impressive release with a great amount of supplemental features that should please most fans of the film. So while I have my definite issues with the film, I did enjoy this revisit, and also being able to look at a big 90s action film on a lovely, well-made 4K UHD release with a brand new 4K negative scan and Dolby Vision HDR. So as always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc in order to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Damnful idealistic crusader, you will find 10 credits for a violation of the being too critical about a video release morality statute. Aw, dag nabbit, it was just a few little video errors I noticed. I mean, I had to talk about some of the quirks and some of the slight issues in the audio. Idealistic crusader, you will find 10 credits for a violation I'm not being that negative, but if I don't talk about this stuff, who will? Be well, I guess.